Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Welcome to the Good Leadership podcast. My guest for this episode, once again, is Dr. Heidi Hanna, who is the Chief Energy Officer of Synergy Brain Fitness, a company providing brain-based health and performance programs to individuals and organizations. We had her on the program prior to discuss that sharp solution, the brain-based approach to optimal performance. You'll see that link in the show notes. Today, though, we want to talk about her other two great books, Stressaholic and Recharge. Thank you, Heidi, again for joining me for the podcast.
Well, it is great to be here. And I think it would be fun just to let everyone know how much stress we have been dealing with and getting to this point. Because a lot of times, people say, well, why did you write these books? Well, stress is everywhere. And let me tell you, if you claim to be a stress expert, you are really going to be challenged, right? But we have dealt with it and here we are, and nothing major, which is good. But we also learned from all of those experiences, which is good.
That's right. So provide our listeners some insight as far as what got you interested in really researching and studying this topic.
Well, it's funny to say stress is actually like my favorite thing to learn about because it's so universal. Everyone experiences it, everyone talks about it, but few people really know what's happening because of it. And, we hear about good stress and bad stress, but I would go to as far to say, like, there's not even really good stress and bad stress. There's good outcomes and bad outcomes to both positive and negative experiences that we have. So it's so complex. And what really initially brought my attention to it, I shared in our previous podcast. So I'll just give kind of the quick version that when I was about 12 years old, I started experiencing panic attacks and I started actually fainting. And the doctors couldn't figure out what was going on and ultimately said it's probably just stress. Those continued. And I will say, because a lot of people will ask if I still have that, I ended up developing a condition called vasovagal syndrome, which is essentially like an opposite reaction to stress. So when most people have their heart pounding, and they get really warm and this experience of anxiety, for me, my blood vessels dilate, blood pools to my feet, and I end up fainting. So once I faint, I'm actually fine. And it does still happen. It doesn't happen nearly as often because I can tell when it's coming. But what's so interesting to me is that even at a young age, I was fairly intelligent when it came to mind and body. I studied psychology, I studied nutrition and physiology, and yet I couldn't control my own nervous system, even with all the tools, with all the therapy, different medications. So I really wanted to better understand what actually was happening. And I was absolutely fascinated with all the research that's already been done that I think most people are unaware of. I even started a global stress summit where I interviewed probably 50 of the top stress researchers, which was such a gift because I was able to have conversations with them and more deeply understand what was going on. And then I guess I made it my mission to try to share these insights with other people in a way that was as practical and applicable as possible. And for me, I believe the key to kind of changing culture really lies in organizations and business, because we have to have a good reason and the support to make some of these changes. And within organizations, we actually have all of the things we need, like social support, financial resources, goals, purpose, opportunities to train our cognitive fitness, things like that. And so I think it's our responsibility to be thinking about it more proactively. So not stress management workshops, but really educating people on brain health and performance and the critical role that stress mastery plays in all of that.
Well, I love to hear your definition of stress because you make the statement that really stress is not the enemy. So how do you
Oh,
define stress?
yeah. So this is refined even more since I wrote Stressaholic because of the conversations that I had. And I kept hearing this underlying element that was really the core, which was that stress is what happens when demand exceeds capacity. And so there's no judgment in that. It's just something that happens. And it's experienced different by different people, depending on all sorts of different factors, how we were raised, our financial support. It's essentially how many resources do we have to deal with the demands that we're up against. And if we kind of look at that, there's an intersection where demand and capacity connect to where they meet each other, right? And that's really the tipping point of what we might call acute stress, short term stress. So, in that moment, stress is really helpful. It gives us energy, it improves our immune system, it helps us to actually connect with other people. And you can see that in all the different chemicals that are released in this short term stress response. The challenge is that everyday nagging chronic stress, like feeling like there's not enough time to get it all done, which most people experience, that starts to shift so that quick stress response system can only last so long. And in fact, it's estimated to last only about 30 minutes or less. And so if anything takes longer than that, if you can't actually run away or fight off a predator, you're going into this slower stress response system. And that's really where we see the problems that stress can cause. Immune function goes down, focus goes down, memory goes down. We have elevated cortisol levels that causes, excuse me, wear and tear on our cardiovascular system. So to me, even though it's not, I'm making it bigger because I want to go straight into like, well, let's think about all these different elements. It still comes down to demand versus capacity. It's just what intensity for how long, what are our circumstances going into it that really start to shape what I believe is our relationship with stress.
Well, and stress, like you just stated, is anything that causes change. It's neither good nor bad, and it can be positive and beneficial, like exercise for the body. Stresses your body, but it's good for you. Flu shots,
Yeah.
right? It stresses your body, but can enhance your defenses, right? And build immunity. So
Yeah.
you're right that it's neither good nor bad. The long-term stress has some harmful effects, and it can cause, more serious issues over a prolonged period of time. But you even go as far, and I agree with this too, is that our society has almost become addicted to it.
Yes.
So talk to me about stress addiction and what that's like, and how prevalent is it in our society?
Yeah. So I'm smiling because I can remember like it was yesterday, like many of people in the audience may relate to this. I was working all the time. And so my idea of a vacation was like, if I'm going to speak somewhere, I'll stay an extra day and go to the spa. So I was still working, I was still around work people, but I managed to kind of escape. And in this particular day, I went to the spa and I was sitting in a hot tub, and they even had a list of things to do, which is perfect for me, right? Just tell me how to relax and I'll do that. So I was like, do this, do this, do this. And I closed my eyes and I was like, oh my God, this is so boring. I just want to go back to work. And I really caught myself thinking, is it that I love work? Is it I don't like being still? Like, what's going on here? And it was really a personal understanding of, I think I'm addicted to the stress and the noise and the drive. And, what does that mean? I was so surprised when I started researching how much has already been done on stress addiction because it releases a lot of the same chemicals that other behavioral addictions do. And it seems, just kind of from a survival perspective, that the reason for this is that the brain really wants to remember what is causing us stress so that it can help protect us in the future. And how we remember is a lot of the reward pathway that kind of consolidates that experience. So it's very easy to be driven back to it. It's also something that we can become tolerant to, which is another element of addiction where we need more and more and more in order to get that same kind of high feeling from it. A lot of my clients who are incredibly successful are adrenaline junkies, and there may be nothing wrong with that as long as there's no negative outcomes to that. But it can lead to things like not just high speed driving and racing and jumping out of planes, but even things like gambling, unhealthy relationships, things like that. So it's fascinating to me that we can become addicted to it. And I always tell people, if you're not sure if you're addicted to it, then just try relaxing for a little while and see how you feel. Close your eyes and just be still. And does that feel comfortable to you? Or does your mind instantly start going into got to do this, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this, because that I have more I need to do than what I can do right now is causing that chemical stress reaction.
And that's such an important question to ask yourself. And I think that's critical. Not many people are asking this is, have you ever noticed how difficult it is to actually relax
Totally.
and to really feel that you're relaxed and how quickly you can become relaxed? Relaxation is not only good for your brain, but it's also good for your health. It keeps you healthy. It helps you to lose weight. All these positive
Mhm.
health benefits on relaxation, where it's not really the focal point in today's society. It's just how much more can you get done? How productive can you be? And not enough focus or information or or talk is about how can you better relax because you need those rejuvenation periods, right?
Absolutely. And, you bring up a good point. Even when you were saying that stress can be good for you, we need some stress. In fact, one of the highest spikes in human mortality when we see the most people dying is within 6 months of retirement. And what can happen to this organism that's used to going and going and going and going, and then has nothing to do, no reason to get out of bed, is a total crash of that system. So we're supposed to have these ups and downs. And we talked about it in the last discussion of oscillations. We're supposed to have day and night, and we're supposed to have stress and recovery and on a regular basis. So we just want to be mindful that most people don't need a prescription for more stress, they need a prescription for the opposite. And to recognize that it takes time and practice, just like anything else. When you were sharing about relaxation, it suddenly hit me that really just within the last couple of months, I've finally gotten the point where I can put myself into a state of relaxation within a couple of minutes with a particular guided meditation that I've been listening to now for 2 years. But now, as soon as it starts, it's like my body knows, and I'm walking through this wonderful guided meditation that works for me. But now I can actually like physically feel it in my body. So it's not like escaping the stress, it's actually engaging into and soaking up the chemicals that are released when we actually relax.
That's so critical. And I hope our listeners can take that to heart and really be mindful and intentional to make relaxation more of a priority.
Yeah.
In your model, your stressaholic model, there's really 5 steps. The first 3 steps in the stressaholic recovery process are designed to help you recharge your
Mm.
energy by eliminating unnecessary stress and stimulation. The final 2 steps of the recovery process helps you reprogram your habits
Yeah.
and how you think and how you act. So, step one, let's start with that. And that's really the rest phase, balancing your brain chemistry with strategic, I love that word, strategic relaxation and recovery. Can
Yeah.
you unpack that a little bit for us? Maybe provide us a tool in which our listeners could use.
Yeah. I giggle thinking about how my brain tends to work in fives and threes. And it's not because anyone taught me to do that. They just feel right for some reason. And in this case, I did both, right? I was like, there's five, but then there's three, and then there's these two. And I think again, it goes to moving past information and really thinking about transformation. So I can't just tell you to just do all of this stuff. We got to really think about building blocks, in a certain way. And they tend to line up with whether that was my intention or not, the way that the brain and the nervous system are organized. So it starts at the base and the most primitive, instinctual, and then more emotional and more cognitive. So that starting point has to be what helps us feel like we can survive. And so that is breath. Most importantly, it's the rate of our breathing cycle. And if you hold your breath or breathe too rapidly, you're cueing the brain that there's an emergency. If you can get yourself to do optimal breathing or what's known as resonant breathing, then you get kind of the breath and the heart working together to calm the system down in some ways, but it's not like it's calming it down to go to sleep. It's actually calming it down to focus it for performance, which is a very different way of kind of tuning in our energy in the best way. So I know we talked about previously, so I don't want to go into too much detail on it, but there's so many different ways we can do breathing exercises. There's apps and tools that can help with breathing exercises. meditation and mindfulness, it's really focused on relaxation. So I personally love guided meditations that just kind of walk you through whether it's progressive relaxation of the body or some sort of visualization that allows you to let go. That can be helpful. But also things like physical touch. So it could be getting a massage, it could be a long hug with an appropriate person. I want to make sure I say that. If you have a partner, a family member, or a pet, we know that 20 seconds, I think it is, of hugging stimulates oxytocin hormone that is very, very healing in the brain and body. But also things like aromatherapy and different colors and different sounds and music, all of those things, if they're working in a way that is harmonious and balancing, can help our nervous system to have a sense of relief as well.
Those are some great tips and advice for that area. After you've committed to that first step of rest, now it's you move into step two, the repair mode, where
Mm.
you're calming and nourishing cells with energy enhancing nutrients, nourishing the mind by practicing gratitude. There's a lot of studies on this, a lot of research that says it's one of the healthiest emotions to have.
Yeah.
How do you make it more a part of your life? What are some simple practices that you would recommend?
I think all of these things really need to be almost like what's the smallest thing you could do that would have the biggest impact? Because then it's more realistic. We don't want to add more stress by trying to fix stress. But some of these things are really simple and need to be individualized as well. So I think with nutrition and what we feed our body, it's really thinking about optimizing or maximizing the good stuff. I think I talk about the stressful seven foods in the book Stressaholic, which are just some of the foods that cause the most inflammation. Anti-inflammatory foods are the ones that are most nourishing. So you don't have to be perfect, but if you just look at a Mediterranean type of diet, high in healthy fats, eating fish, mostly produce, but you can certainly have lean proteins as well. I try not to bait people on nutrition because there's a lot of research about a lot of benefits of a lot of different things. So you do want to make sure that it's realistic for you to sustain and that you like it. But as I shared before, if you need to make it easier for yourself, even temporarily, there's some great meal services that are not very expensive nationwide that can put together something that fits into, what you need. So I think that's very much worth the investment. And then as far as the mind goes, I feel like we think about what we put in our body, but not so much the information that we consume.
You're right.
And when we wake up first thing in the morning, the brain is most flexible and adaptable to take in new information. So that time frame is really critical, as is right before bed, because we're getting ready to sleep. And so we're putting things in that actually may affect how we sleep. So to me, those are kind of the bookends of the day. And so in the morning, I think it's a matter of finding what works for you that you'll actually utilize. But some of the things I've tried and my clients have tried could be music. When I'm really struggling with maybe a depression or something, I'll have a song, up to 3 songs that I'll just play every morning. First thing I do when I get up, I play a song that's inspiring for me. And so before I even think about what I need to do, I'm putting this in and somehow it's changing my perspective on what does need to get done. So music can be super helpful with that. What we read, most people probably don't read first thing in the morning, but I know that this is a habit we teach at the Global Leadership Academy for Entrepreneurs Organization is a 10-10-10. So when you wake up in the morning, you have 10 minutes of reading and 10 minutes of writing and 10 minutes of essentially meditation or thinking about whatever it is. And so we give away different books with inspirational quotes or whatever it is. And every morning people start this habit and they do it for a week. And it's amazing the impact it has on people that they then take that home. It's just creating the habit. Of course, we wake them up at 6 o'clock in the morning and make them do it. But by the time they leave, they actually realize, oh, this actually had an impact on me. So information, podcasts are another great thing. Or if you're a spiritual person, maybe listening to a spiritual message. But in addition to what you're putting in, then I also want to emphasize what you're not putting in first thing. So you're not checking your phone, checking your email, reading the news, watching the news until you've had a dose of something nourishing. Doesn't mean you could never do it. I tend to watch the news first thing in the morning, but not until I've done my meditation and had some physical exercise.
Well, and right, and doing the gratitude journal for me helps every morning. It reminds ourselves of what's good in our life and makes us more optimistic about our outlook on the world, right? The more positive you put in, the less you're going to focus on what's negative and being mindful, like you stated, on what you put into your brain. Everyone looks at and is really focused on what they're putting in their body. They don't want to put junk food in their body, but how many of us are looking at all the junk food we're putting in our minds by the information we're consuming? And I think if we could be more mindful and deliberate with that approach, that can make a big impact on the quality of our life.
Yeah, and just a couple notes on that. I love that. I think it can be helpful to be creative with some of these as well. So the gratitude research, which is fantastic, shows effect of doing gratitude journaling, for like 6 months later, less depression, less anxiety, all of that. So we know it works. One thing, because a good friend of mine was involved with some of that research, one of the things he pointed out is that they now know that not just writing down what you're grateful for, but why enhances the benefits of that. So it doesn't just become kind of a detailed checklist, but here's what and here's why. I think there's more emotion conveyed in that. The other thing is that you can be creative, whether it's at work or with your family, with something like a gratitude jar where you write it down, put it in the jar, maybe once a week, once a month. People will take them out and read them. So it can be anonymous, but you're sharing that information. It can be kind of a group ritual. And then the last one, and I actually wrote a book called What's So Funny About Stress. And essentially it was about humor, which is another area that I've studied, is that we've seen similar results from the use of healthy humor as gratitude. And I think this can be especially helpful with kids who may not quite understand gratitude yet, but they may understand being amused. I would say being amazed and amused by what I'm grateful for, amused by what I can find funny. And so the same kind of exercise, maybe doing it at night at dinner, everyone write down one thing that you found funny today. And what that starts to do is then focus their attention the following day on things that they can find amusing. And of course, we want to keep it healthy. We're not laughing at other people, but silly things, ironic things, we can share examples, we can laugh together. And it's amazing the healing benefit of healthy humor. It's really powerful.
You're right. And I even find it easier for me to make that a habit to devote certain times of the day to put on something that I find humorous and to laugh. And it's sad to say that you almost have to schedule time for this.
Yep.
But in today's society, I don't think we get enough humor. We're not laughing enough throughout the course of our day unless we're going to be intentional in finding ways or opportunities to have that emotional experience.
Yeah. It's such an incredible I'm part of a organization called the Association for Applied and Therapeutic Humor, which makes me laugh because it just sounds so boring. But really we research those types of things. And I think there's a lot of reasons. I think even more now, just because of the way that the culture is, that we're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, or we see a lot of humor being used politically in negative ways. So I think it's good to be cautious, but that's also why it's good to have your humor homies, like the people you can be authentic with. You can share funny things. My best friend sends me something funny, just a meme every day. And she always says it's not just good for me, but it's good for her on the sending side. I send her stuff maybe once a week, right? But she is really dedicated. And right now it's funny. I told her she's the best because now they're all about cats. So knowing the person, that you're sharing humor with, that may seem forced, but it has such an effect and it helps us to feel connected when we're not able to spend time together.
You're right. So step one is rest. Step two is repair. Step three is rebuilding by strengthening your mental and physical fitness. So give us some tools around this area that you think would help our listeners in really trying to rebuild this.
Yeah. So we're thinking about, I guess, conceptually, is that before we do anything, we need to make sure that we kind of balance the environment, nourish and heal the environment before we strengthen it. And I find a lot of people come to me asking for, brain training games or physical fitness plans or whatever it might be. And yet their stress is so bad, their sleep is so bad, their nutrition is so bad that you're just breaking down a system that can't build up. So that's why I put this one third intentionally, is so that you make sure you're working with essentially the raw materials you need to see improvements. And so you can look again at, what does that mean for my body? Physical exercise, aerobic training. There's so many different ways to do that. We know that it is, critical. And I would say It's even more of a focus of mine now, having gone a couple of years with much less physical activity than before. I unfortunately had a very unexpected blood clot, and so just went through a lot of trauma physically. And it's taken me a while to get back to that place. But I've noticed the difference it makes in not just being about body size, but about energy and focus and attention and positivity and all of those things. So I tend to not do a one size fits all suggestion there because there's so many different experts in the area. But I will say, if you want to understand more why it's so important, Dr. John Rady, who wrote the book Spark, has also written several other books, but you can also Google him and watch some of his videos. They're absolutely amazing, talking about what happens to the brain when we exercise the body. And he says we get basically the 5 most popular pharmaceutical drugs created by our own brain with no side effects. And so I think that it's become, for me, just a daily, it's just not an option anymore. You just do 30 minutes at least, more if you can. And then with the brain, there's a lot of brain training games and exercises out there, and a lot of them are very helpful. The challenge that I have in recommending them sometimes is that we spend so much time in front of a computer that I would rather, if someone's going to dedicate the time, that they do some things that are good for their brain off the computer. And that could even mean things like music and meditation and mindfulness, like we've talked about before. It could be learning a new language. It could be playing a musical instrument, volunteering in some way. It's like what we really want to try to do is focus the brain in a way that's different from what we're doing on a regular basis to strengthen some of those pathways. And anytime we're learning something new, learning a new sport, reading books on history, and anytime we're learning something new that matters to us, we are going to be training the brain and essentially generating potentially new brain cells. So the only ways that we know that we do that are through aerobic exercise and learning. You can also use some of the tools online. Many of them are wonderful. You just want to make sure that what you're training is something specific to some sort of measured outcome. So there's like cognitive behavioral training games, there's spatial awareness games, there's focus and attention games, there's all sorts of stuff. And my personal favorite is with my colleague, Evie and Gordon, is called My Brain Solutions, or actually it's now called Total Brain. And they do what I like. They do an assessment beforehand. I know a lot of them do. So you can actually see what you're working on and see what your improvements are.
Those are some great tips and advice because you're right. There's so much out there. It's a huge industry right now with the neurotropics for the brain enhancing drugs. There's reportedly brain enhancing drugs as well as these cognitive fitness games. And I find that from what I've read, it really comes back down to the basic is,
Mhm.
what's good for your body is good for your brain. And the more physical exercise you can give your body, that's really going to impact your brain by a lot, and that might be the best form of treatment moving forward versus trying to do more crossword puzzles or brain apps where you're just focusing on one area
Yeah. And
and
once
not
you learn them, you're not really challenging the brain anymore. You're
right.
doing pattern recognition.
It's the
Um,
novelty aspect
yeah.
that
And
you
you
have
also
to make sure.
reminded me of something. I can't remember which book I wrote about this, but it was a study that I saw that rats who were forced to run on a treadmill didn't get the benefits of those who selected to run on a treadmill. And I just was thinking about how many of us like force ourselves to run on a treadmill trying to get in better shape, but we're just annoyed and stressed and whatever. So I would say the same with brain training and things like that. If we're doing it because we're interested and we're learning something and we're enjoying that, and if it's social too, like all of those things add layers to things that will be beneficial versus, staring at a computer screen, which we tend to do a lot anyway.
Very well said. So step 4 now is we're in the rethinking phase by shifting our perspective to see stress as a challenge instead of a threat. Now that's tough for a lot of people to do. What's some advice you can give them to change that perspective?
I think to break it down even more into what we're dealing with, and we kind of started with this, is to remember that stress is what happens when demand exceeds capacity. So we can look in an experience where we're feeling stress at both of those factors. What are the demands and what's my capacity? And to try to make this real, or if it's perceived, to just be aware of that as well. Like, am I really, if I'm going to get up and give a presentation? Are people really going to throw tomatoes at me? Or is that just, my fear? Because then I need to deal with that in a different way. But I think when we do that, then we see that there's this gap between the two that needs to be filled. And we can start to say, well, what can I shift? What am I in control of? So one of the times we experience the most stress is when we have no control over our situation. And if we have no control over our situation, really the only thing we can do to navigate it better is to improve our capacity to cope. So instead of fixating on, this horrible thing, if I were to think of COVID, it feels like one of the only things I could think of. Because if I think of a job, a relationship, all sorts of things, I could say, well, you actually have a choice. You don't have to have that job. You will have to have a job. But COVID, I have to stay at home. I mean, I guess people could say that they had a choice, but if you're going to follow, what we were all kind of dealing with, I have no choice. I can continue to be mad, frustrated, angry, whatever at the situation. Or I can say, because the situation is challenging, what can I do to build my capacity? What resources are available to me? The thing with stress is that as soon as we start to try to put together a plan of action in a way that we can control, the effect minimizes it because it no longer goes from a threat. Now it's a challenge because we're doing something. So I always think about stress as like this little ball of light and energy that's just waiting to see what we're going to do. And if we mobilize it in some way, it's released. And if we hold on to it, push it down, push it away, it festers. So I still will say it's not the situation. I would never say COVID was good because we learned from it. I would never say it's good that a friend of mine lost her leg in a motorcycle accident because now she's grateful for what she has. Like, that's going too far. What I would say is in those situations, these are horrible situations that still have an opportunity for something positive to come out of them. When we deal with trauma, that process takes longer. And I'm always very careful. I'm not the kind of person that's going to come in and be like, okay, what can we see that's good in this? It's more letting the person kind of take the path that they have to take to get to that point. But most times they do because the human system is so resilient.
Thank you for providing that. I want to get to that final stage before we end today's podcast. And that fifth and final stage is the redesign by developing beads. That's an acronym that provides structure for ongoing energy management and oscillation. Perhaps you can unpack that acronym for our listeners, because I think that's really helpful for them to use in this context.
So we were talking before, and I said, some of these books I wrote so long ago, and I use a lot of these acronyms and fives and threes, and I don't know, my content keeps changing, but this is what I actually think I do remember. So boundaries,
Yeah.
expectations, attitude, time.
You got it.
Yes. Okay. Because, I don't really even hardly consider myself a writer. I've written because it's come out of a place of feeling something was important to share and really just wanting to share that with people. So this was one that wasn't like, oh, let's use the word beats and see if we can come up with something. It just was, what do I think is necessary? And does that fit into something that will be helpful? And it's beats, like heartbeats to me. It's how do we create more of an oscillation pattern in our lives and really redesigning not just the way we do our day, but redesigning the way that our brain works and our nervous system works to help move us in that direction. So boundaries and expectations actually kind of go hand in hand. Boundaries could be anything from how you set your schedule and your calendar to even physical boundaries in your space of having a door that closes. If you don't have a door that closes, can you put a sign up that signifies when you're in focus mode and when you're not? Open offices, I think, are a nightmare. I would squirm a little when I say that. I know they were really popular for a while, but especially for more highly sensitive people, it's just a lot of stress in one environment. So having spaces people could go to. So essentially, it's just what's the container I can use to help me apply these things that we're talking about. And then expectation. So boundary for me may be I'm only going to check email at this time and this time during the day. Expectation is to make sure I'm communicating that with other people and setting expectations for them. I have friends and clients that I expect to hear from in 5 minutes. And I've got another really good friend, and I always laugh when I think of this, that I probably won't hear from for 2 weeks. Like, even if he could respond in 5 minutes, I think he like tries to respond in 2 weeks. And he's a positive psychology researcher. So I think he does it on purpose. But I don't think less of him. I just know that. And it's probably not 2 weeks. It's probably, a couple of days, but I just know that about him. So the expectation isn't there. And I think a lot of times we assume we have to respond in a certain amount of time because that's what it's expected, but we haven't communicated that. For sake of time, I won't go into that more, but I will say the whole field of digital wellness is super important to me. And a big piece of that is having communication charters where we share with each other how we're going to best communicate if we're going to work together. And that helps to level those expectations. Attitude can be, again, on both sides, but it's primarily about how we share that. So one of the things that we can do that's nice is things like an email signature. So instead of saying I'm out of the office, blah, 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 you could come up with something creative or meaningful, share what you're actually doing or have something humorous that you're sharing. It's all about how we share and the reason behind it. So it's not, I think I'm better than you and I'm only going to work 2 days a week. But being able to share, I'm so grateful to work with an organization that allows me some flexibility to be at home with my children. Totally different experience for the people that we're with. And then time is really just to know that it's going to take time for other people to fully understand that. And again, this could be I'm going to go to the gym at this time. How am I going to do that? What boundaries am I going to set around that? How do I share to make sure expectations are met, that my gym time isn't my downtime, but this is an investment I have in myself. And those things can make a huge difference, not only I think for the individual, but also if we want to see more of a change culturally with the organization.
Thank you for unpacking that. I think that's a really helpful acronym for them to be thinking about as they're trying to design for deliberate times throughout the day to do certain things, to have those rejuvenation times and to provide a structure for your energy management.
Yeah.
Now, that follow-up book that you have from Stressaholic, you go to Recharge and give us some insight into what the purpose of this book was and how it really adds to the model.
Yeah. So I really never set out to write a book. I mentioned that before. I definitely didn't set out to write 7 of them. Every time I did another one, I was just like, oh, I have something to say. And so they got shorter and a little less research and a little less citations. And this was just like, here's the message. And the reason for that was in these processes I outlined, I kept talking about recharging your own battery. And people kept asking me, what do you mean? And like, well, what do you do just for fun? Or what do you do to feel good? Or what do you do to take a break? And people just looked perplexed. So what I started to do is actually I had this activity and I just said, okay, well, let's just look at the timeline of your day from the time you get up to the time you go to bed. Is it a flat line? Are you oscillating? And so we look at these 5 different things. When do you eat? When do you move your body? When do you sleep and for how long? When do you recharge with something enjoyable? And when do you have social connection? So we started kind of looking at that. And I found just a lot of flat lines. And so I started using that timeline of your day of like, okay, what are we going to do here? What are we going to do here? What are we going to do here? And essentially wrote the book to include that activity of like, here's a way you can do an energy audit for yourself of on a daily basis. Am I flatlining or am I oscillating? And how can I create more shifts during the day, including when I go to bed and when I wake up first thing in the morning? So that's what the book is. And it's so simple, but I find that throughout that process that I can get into more details with people on, give us some examples. So I have a lot of examples in the book of things that people may find helpful.
Well, I always like to end, as you know, each episode with that action tip. So it'd be great to give maybe a few of those tips that you can share with our listeners on how they can recharge quickly and effectively.
I think I would do the bookends, really think about your day and what you do first thing in the morning and what you do right before you go to bed. And consider making an adjustment to one of those that will be beneficial for your brain. I don't like to choose because I like people to choose the one that either they think will be easiest for them to do or have the most impact. Some people already have a ritual in the morning. A lot of people don't have one at night. But to just be thinking about that, what am I going to feed my brain? What information, what experience am I going to give myself first thing in the morning or right before bed that's going to allow me to have the best sleep if it's at night or to have the best day ahead if it's in the morning.
Well, thank you again for joining me, Heidi, for this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Remind our listeners on how they can get in contact with you.
Sure. You can go to my website, which is HeidiHanna.com. And I also have, I said last time before, I actually have 16, but that's because they're translated into different languages, which is awesome. Courses that are available on LinkedIn Learning, many of which are free. So people can connect with me on LinkedIn. Let me know that you heard me on the podcast so that I know to accept your connection right away.
Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into this topic and all the tips and tools that were shared. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. As always, you can head over to my LinkedIn page where you can see all the latest articles and posts from me. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. I look forward to serving you in the next episode, so hit subscribe and I'll see you then. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.